The most dramatic and heart-wrenching chapter of Baltic history is the guerrilla war fought by Estonians, Latvians and Lithuanians against the Soviet Union from 1944 until 1956. This was not a conventional war with large armies, tanks and front lines. It was a war of shadows fought in forests and small villages. It was a war where ordinary people stood up against one of the most powerful regimes of the 20th century. And it was a war that continues to shape the Baltic states' identity and their modern relationship with Russia. This is the story of the Forest Brothers. The story begins in the chaos of World War II. The Baltic states had already been through a lot. In 1940, they were occupied by the Soviet Union as part of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a secret deal between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union to divide Eastern Europe.
The Nazi-Soviet Pact and its secret protocol was a treaty for war.
For a brief moment in 1941, the Nazi invasion pushed the Soviets out. But by 1944, the Red Army was advancing back into the region, reclaiming territory from the retreating Germans. For many in Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, this wasn't liberation, it was a return to terror. The Soviet regime had already shown its brutality during its first occupation. The Great Purge, deportations, executions, and the suppression of the national identity were common. When the Red Army came back in 1944, thousands of people decided they would rather fight than live under Soviet rule. These resistance fighters called themselves the Forest Brothers. The name wasn't just poetic, it was literal. These fighters took to the dense Baltic forests to wage a guerrilla war against the Soviet forces. Some were former soldiers, others were farmers, students, teachers or even priests. What united them was love for their people and their refusal to accept Soviet occupation. At their peak, the Forest Brothers numbered around 50,000 across 3 Baltic states. Their strategy was simple: ambush Soviet patrols, sabotage supply lines, and carry out raids on local Communist Party offices. They knew they couldn't defeat the Soviet Union in a conventional war, but they could make the occupation as costly and difficult as possible. The Soviets saw the Forest Brothers as a major threat. Their response was brutal and uncompromising. NKVD troops were sent in to crush the resistance. Villages suspected of harboring Forest Brothers were burned to the ground. Entire families were deported to Siberia as punishment. By the late 1940s, over 200,000 people from the Baltic states had been sent to labor camps. One particularly horrifying tactic was the use of deception. Soviet forces would dress as resistance fighters to gain the trust of locals, only to turn on them. They also employed vast networks of informants, turning neighbor against neighbor. The psychological toll was immense. Imagine living in a small village, not knowing if the person you're talking to is a friend or a spy. The Soviets also employed sheer military might. Entire divisions were deployed to hunt down the Forest Brothers. Special NKVD units used brutal interrogation methods on captured partisans and their supporters. Torture, executions and public humiliations were common. For the Forest Brothers, life was anything but glamorous. They lived in makeshift bunkers, constantly on the move to avoid detection. Winters were especially harsh. Food was scarce and medical supplies were almost non-existent. Many relied on sympathetic locals for supplies, but this was a double-edged sword. Helping the resistance was punishable by death or deportation. Despite the hardships, the Forest Brothers persevered. They created underground newspapers to spread their message and keep the spirit of resistance alive. They created underground newspapers to spread their message and keep the spirit of resistance alive. They even held small ceremonies to celebrate national holidays, reminding themselves and their supporters that their country still existed in spirit even if occupied. An interesting detail is that Soviet officers rarely stopped and searched women, as they couldn't be mobilized for the Red Army. Male partisans were aware of this and often disguised themselves in women's clothing while traveling. By the late 1940s, the Soviet Union's counterinsurgency efforts began to take their toll. Advanced surveillance methods, combined with an overwhelming number of troops, made it increasingly difficult for the Forest Brothers to operate. In Lithuania, for example, fighters like Adolfas Ramanauskas, known as Vanagas or the Hawk, continued to lead operations into the 1950s. He was eventually captured, tortured, and executed by the Soviets in 1957. The last known forest brother in Estonia is August Sabbe. KGB agents posing as fishermen found Sabbe while he was fishing, so Sabbe leaped into the river and used his fishing hook to hook himself to a log, drowning himself so that the Soviets could not capture him. Why did they keep fighting, even when the odds were so overwhelmingly against them? The answer lies in their belief in freedom. To the Forest Brothers, this was about preserving the idea of an independent Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Many of them knew they wouldn't live to see the end of the Soviet rule, but they hoped their sacrifice would inspire future generations, and they were right. When the Soviet Union finally collapsed in 1991, the memory of the Forest Brothers played a key role in the Baltic states' push for independence. Today, the Forest Brothers' story is central to Baltic national identity. Streets, schools, and monuments honor their memory, while books and documentaries pass their story to new generations. For the Baltics, their guerrilla war is a stark reminder of the cost of Soviet occupation and the need to defend sovereignty. The Forest Brothers' legacy proves that even in the darkest times, people fight for freedom and small nations can stand against great powers. As we look at the challenges facing the world today, from the war in Ukraine to the rise of authoritarianism, the legacy of the Forest Brothers feels more relevant than ever. Their story reminds us that freedom is never guaranteed. It must be defended.